never really know when to start because it's recording in progress. Says it's recording, and it's like dot
Yeah,
dot dot.
and you make something with your hands, and then we can cut.
Yeah. Well, I already started. I was saying I never know where to start. It's what is this, like the third episode that we have, or step three? I don't know what we're calling it. We're deciding between names, muddy middle, messy middle, gritty middle, who's middle.
I have no idea. Yeah. No,
Yeah,
messy middle is fine. It's definitely okay. Just
I
yeah.
like the I like that it's the perfect analogy. Like it's like I have no idea. It's it's like even the name, everything is just very confusing when you're in between.
Yeah, we just like to keep it confusing for everybody.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. I think the topics are today, as usual. We'll do a little update from each of us. We haven't brought in any extra guests yet because we don't want to embarrass our friends at this point, but we will bring in some people, maybe by
Of
like
course.
episode five, right?
Yeah.
Um, but the quick overview is, and this will probably be a faster episode this week because Frank is traveling. I'm back from San Francisco and Carmel. I'm in Florida. It is boring as hell here. I mean, it's like raining. It's not even a good time to
Mhm.
be in Florida. Uh, but the topics will be quick updates from our end, a little bit of discussion of like in the in between period, do we pick up some gigs? Do we get some contract work? Do we, how do we actually do it from our personal experience? And then we'll finish with some fun topic that Frank will think about while we're discussing all of that. But let's first start with Teddy. So from last Monday to this Monday, anything that really rocked your world?
yeah. I've been definitely busy with GPTs and trying to figure out how this whole system will evolve and how to take advantage of it. Created a bunch of GPTs. Right now they don't have any. I mean, they claim to be releasing this marketplace soon, so I'm hoping I'll see that this or next week. But for now, there's no way to discover new GPTs. So you just like share them on X and share them with friends to get a feedback. But I think there's huge potential. Yeah, I've been mainly busy with creating those things now.
So much so that you can't even use the other recording platform that we want for the messy middle.
Yes,
Um, for such an engineer of your standard, how could you get such a low amount of RAM or memory
I
on
should have been smarter when I bought this laptop 3 years ago. So it's old already. So I'm looking to get a new one. And back then I was like, why would I have more space on my laptop? I'm just running code and the code doesn't need a lot of space. But AI wasn't as big as it is right now. So you don't have to download larger models. You don't have to have a data sets, but now you have to do it. So yeah, I ran out of memory. So I'm just like constantly fighting, wasting hours a day trying to minimize and optimize. But yeah, I promise I'll have a better machine soon. I can't even do a recording properly.
that's okay. As long, I mean, it's so advice to everyone out there is maybe get a little bit more memory when you do it. Unless you're like a business guy like myself. I probably have way too much memory on my machine that I never use. Frank, what's up with you?
Well, traveling in France, going to our new office for the first time. I kind of reminds me at the time of Startup Weekend, I think we had 5 offices and I've only been to one of them. And so so it's kind of nice to to see new office, new team, and a kind of a segue into what do you guys do in gigs in between. And usually what I do is I kind of hire myself for other startups. So I guess my way of approaching this thing is a little weird, which is I'm like a solo studio, so I launch startups, I spend time in it, I invest in it, and then everything I do then is I hire as many people as I can, but I still pay myself a little and keep working in it. And and that's enough for me to fuel
What's
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 next.
a little? What yeah? What's a little? I mean, we
Um,
all have different. We have all different ideas of what a little is, but
no,
for
no, no.
you,
I mean,
how do you do
it's really small. I mean, I'm gonna be like full transparent. It's like around maybe 3K a month, for and honestly, right now I'm working maybe 3-4 days a week on it, but it's an investment, and the idea is just to get the team going. So that's fine. And if there's no cash, definitely get a job. I mean, like everybody's unique, but I would assume, if as soon as you have 6 months or less of cash in your bank account for the foreseeing future, I guess that's a good time for you to be like, okay, I might pause entrepreneurship and just go for a normal job. I mean, at least
have you ever done that?
no. I've always
That's what I like to hear.
I've
That's in
always
general. You can't say like have a 6 months worth of whatever. It's not like
What's the
that's my
lowest?
recommendation. Like, I'd be again, but like I've never done it because I've always figured out a way to, I'm like, shit, like what am I gonna do? And I always somehow there's always something that comes. And one way I address it is I move to countries where life is cheaper, so that that extend like 6 months of runway in Estonia is not going to be the same as 6 months of runway in New York.
Right, but I think look, I think the reality is Frank figures it out. So that's kind of the entrepreneurial hack that we all have is we figure it out. So you say 6 months. Have you actually recently gone below 6 months in the last recently? I say the last 6 or 7 years.
I guess I have. I
And
guess I
how did
have,
that
but
feel? How did that feel? Did it like give you a desire to want to go figure out what's next faster, or to just make it more difficult?
you feel miserable. You go through these things where you're like, I guess the feeling that it adequate, like that kind of reminds me is whenever I was a student and you feel like if you don't pass a test, your life is over. That's kind of the same feeling I've got when I'm like, oh shit, I did this thing and now I have to figure out what's next, but I can't, like, I'm like, it's really hard to figure out like what job you fit. Usually what happens is to be, oh, I'm an accountant, my job is accounting, or I have this very specific skill. But when you're an entrepreneur, it's like it feels like you can't really apply your skill to anything useful in a corporate context. And so it's kind of a weird thing. But anyway, I'm curious about you guys. Like, have you ever been, in that in between thing where you're like, oh shit, I'm not, I need to make some cash urgently.
Yeah, Teddy, you tell us, because
that's
I'll tell my stuff. So.
That's my blueprint for making things work and figuring things out. I'm intentionally putting myself in a sort of dangerous situation where sometimes it's cash, sometimes it's other resources where you're in lack of those resources. So you got to figure out a way to make it work. Yeah, I've been to like many ups and downs in that regard. And I think it's completely fine to just find a way to make money as long as if that's
totally.
Yeah.
But it's funny how much no one talks about that, right?
Yeah, but I had this idea in my mind that you're an entrepreneur, you're trying to figure things out, you shouldn't be doing that. And then like reading books, for example, Phil Knight in Shoe Dog talks about that. The way he started Nike or whatever the name was before, just like trying to figure things out during a couple of years. It wasn't just like weeks or months. It was a long period of time where he would work somewhere, he would go back, try to do something for the company, doesn't work, go back again. So it's like this process that you should be completely fine with. And
he kept his job. He actually kept his job and did Nike on nights and weekends.
Yeah.
And pulled it out of pulled the stuff out of his trunk. And they kind of asked him like, "Would you have done that again?" And he's like, "Yes," because he's like, "I didn't know what else to do. I didn't have another option." And I think he was lucky. I mean, he went to Stanford, graduated, was able to get a job, and was lucky to actually fit into that scenario. I think for us, I don't know. I've never been able to do it where I have a full-time sort of, and I think he like at some point obviously was like, I'm done with this. But it wasn't like 3 weeks into it. And it wasn't even, you're right, like a year into it. He did it for a few years. And from my experience, I've always had, I think like, if I put a dollar amount on it, 150 plus $1,000 in my account, or 100, right? And when I start seeing get below that, I get very nervous, and this is probably happening pretty soon. And obviously I have shares that I can sell, and but I've never actually kept that much cash in my account, is what I'm saying, regardless of net worth. Own a place here and all of that. For me, if I don't see some cash coming in, I get really nervous. And the SPAC, the past 3 years or 2.5 years I was working on that, I didn't have a single dollar of income from that. But I actually worked on an SPV in the middle of that, which is the first time I've ever done that. So, which I found was interesting. So here's an idea to some people in our audience. If you think there's a startup you like, or a business that your friend runs, and you can raise some money for it, that could be a good angle. And you know, there's a lot of broker dealer issues with that. You can figure out the legal point. But I think I made like 50 or 60K from that SPV, which gave me some runway. And I sold a bunch of shares in Animoca to survive for the last 2 years. And I think now, like recently, and this is what's been poisoning my brain, as Frank says, for the last like week and a half, I got a phone call from a friend in my network. I got a phone call from a friend in my network. I'm going to San Francisco. You know, we had our call from San Francisco last week. The day before I leave from San Francisco, I'm like, okay, I'm going to figure out my life. I'm going to figure out the next thing. X runway. Okay, I have this many months to do it. I had a phone call from a guy, and he's like, hey, I want you to be an advisor for the company that I founded. We raised X amount of dollars. We'll pay you this, and you'll work 8 hours a week, something like that, less than that. And from an ego side, I was like, okay, let me think about it. And I told him yes. And now for the last like week and a half, I've been waiting to see if this contract's going to come through. And we'll follow it through our next
Yeah.
episode to see. But like I could tell you overnight, after like sleeping on it from the Thursday to Friday, arriving in San Francisco and saying yes to it, it felt so good. And it like opened up my eyes, and I was like, okay, I'm going to be able to travel here. I'm going to be able to cover all these costs doing this, and it's going to put me in the position to be more particular about the things that I decide. But really, it felt really freeing. And what was nice, because it's not like a full-time situation, it's an advisory role, and I didn't have to worry about the bills. So now I'm in the process of worrying if the contract's going to come through. And then the next process is worrying if you're actually going to get paid. So it's a totally new experience for me as somebody who normally is in control of these situations.
It will definitely, thanks for sharing that. It will definitely give you some sort of perspective once you, and I've been in similar situation long ago where I took a consulting sort of gig. And then in the middle of it, I was like wondering, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this for this group or this person, this company, if I have my ideas? But then for me, it was different sort of challenges back then, trying to focus more, things like that. But I'm curious also to hear what are some other things that people can do that are in this phase. So advising is one thing, selling shares, if you have selling some assets. Now we're talking about having some cash liquidity. What are some other things that people can do in between that don't feel as strong emotion?
No, I was gonna say, I mean, number one to me is always, and I've been pretty intense about this one, which is how little can I burn? You know, and so I've been down to when I was younger, and it's kind of funny because I don't know, I've got these stories that makes people feel uncomfortable, but I just did it to me as part of the process. But I think extreme was at one point I decided to sleep in the street in San Francisco and see how it felt. And I slept in the park with a couple of guys. Actually, they ended up stealing my computer. So I've learned, you know, don't trust people, and like it's pretty rough out there. But I wanted to see like what's my extreme and comfortable. And I always wondered if I would do a class on entrepreneurship, I'd like to push people to the max, which of course I could never do. But it felt good to see that Elon kind of did that at 1.2. His experiment was $1 a day or $2 a day with a couple of things. But again, like these are extreme. I would never recommend that to anyone. But I mean, number one is if you're burning 5 or 10K a month, there are ways, if you really want to, or if you're extreme, that you can move to a country where you'll be able to live and work on your stuff for $100 a day, for $100 a month, sorry. And so, you know, to me, it's super interesting. Like number one is you can alleviate any stress you have if you have the freedom of mobility. Now, you know, if you have a family and things like that, of course, it gets harder. But to me, that's number one, is reducing that. The other thing I wanted to say is that you guys are amazing, because on my end, what happened is at one point I came back to France, just in between COVID or just before, I can't remember. And then I got the same as you, Gabriel. I got super excited because I saw a job offer for, I don't know, it was like venture relation for Amazon. I was like, this is fucking awesome. Like that's literally a department we helped, I guess, you know, create when startup began up here, because Amazon came to us and say, how can we work together? And then he became that. I was like, that's awesome. We even had interns who ended up working there. And so I was like, oh, it's cool. I'm gonna do that. And then I started to think that's gonna be great. I'm gonna make some money, meet some VC. I'm gonna really help Amazon. It's gonna be awesome. and I didn't get the job, and it feels awful, like to be like in between looking for things, and you have hope, and then the hope disappears, and you're like, holy shit, like what am I good at? Like really like useless piece of shit. And so I just want to tell, entrepreneurs out there, there's this weird thing where when you sell your company, most of the time you're not gonna have that great of an exit, and people don't realize that. But the messages are, congratulations, great job, that's awesome, what's next? And you're like, how am I gonna pay myself in 3 months? And then you feel like ashamed of going out there and be like, hey, do you have any job? I would do anything, so I can pay the bills. And I don't be ashamed, that's especially in America, it's gonna be fine. In Europe, that might be harder, but I think in America, it's totally fine to say, look, I sold my company, I didn't make any money, and I need any kind of income so I can, so I can make it. And it's really hard. And I like, most people don't talk about it. And usually whenever I see people who don't talk about it and I really dive into it, what I see is they're just rich kids. So they have zero pressure on that, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Anyway, like, so it's a huge taboo. Like no one talks about cash, which reminds me just another thing. There was a book about a guy from Harvard who started the book by saying, in Harvard, you study everything: strategy, like management, economics, finance. There's one thing they don't teach you, which is sales.
Yeah.
And to me, the weird thing about entrepreneurship is like the whole thing is about making money. It's about allocating capital towards the right resources. That's the one thing that no one talks about. So super glad that we can talk about money and cash, in this podcast.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think it comes from a standpoint of reality. I obviously we all probably get the similar feeds on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok of, how to make money, how to do this. I mean, there's even the podcast My First Millions, and they're all talking about how, they made all their money, and very similar stories. But these guys have all been in the position where they've made it now. They're coming from that perspective. And the three of us, we've made it in our way of starting companies, selling them, getting to this point, but we're not in the position to be entirely financially free, which I think is cool, because obviously everybody's going to be able in our community to
Which
watch
is
our
99.9% of everybody, right?
exactly, yeah, yeah,
It's normal. This is normality.
yeah, and it's these obscure cases where we see, but even in those cases that I've seen, is look, I'm a part of that post-exit founders group, and they were talking about it today. These guys have made, Frank, you are too, Teddy, I think I sent you an invite. These guys have probably really only made, most of them, millions of dollars, maybe a couple of them tens of millions of dollars, maybe like one or two have made like 100 million plus.
And I don't know if you can mention names, but I mean, it's like very, very big, successful, and very visible companies.
Yeah.
It's not like the tiny ones.
Yeah, and now can't mention names, so keep it, because you got to have some allure and secret to be a post-exit founder like the three of us. But really, the I thought the funniest thing, that while I'm going through this, and I met a bunch of them in San Francisco, is we all had the same conversation, regardless of the level of success that we had. It's figuring out what's next is a challenge, and even if you have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, $100 million in your bank account, you don't necessarily want to be like completely taking everything out of your account and spending it. You want to see some income, even if it's income from the investments, fine, but really the income is from work, and it's a little bit of cash flow. And I think that's and Frank, you could disagree with me on that. If you have that much money, maybe it doesn't matter.
No, yeah, exactly. I know what I'm saying is, if you have cash, you don't necessarily need income. There's going to be, other motivation, but it's one of them, definitely.
Sure. But I think perhaps you don't need cash, but you need motivation to actually do something. And I think that fits in with sort of the theme today is, okay, what do you do to make some cash on the side, which, Teddy was asking. And I think it's getting a advisory role, if you can swing it hard. Frank has swung out on that, and for me, we'll see. Second thing is SPV, raising money and making introductions and doing that. That's hard too, because you need to have a network, and you need to be able to trust the company that you're raising money for, that they're not going to screw your investors. And you kind of want to get other investors, because you want to save some of these investors for yourself, right? But in my case with Animoca, it made sense. They called me, and I think we did a 10 or $20 million SPV, and that worked because I had the relationship with Animoca, because I sold to them. The group that partnered with me on the SPV was able to put all the SPV together, and I knew the cash was coming, because if we raised the money, the cash would be there from the initial payment. I think the third thing is some contract work. If you're an
Mhm.
engineer. I mean, I don't know, Teddy, you can talk about that. And the fourth, of course, you can always get a job. But
Yeah.
good luck.
And
It's really
I'm
hard.
curious about Teddy, like when you do these things, I'm curious about like, do you feel like you can equally work on something on the side and still have enough focus to do something else? Or is it like tearing you apart and you're incapable of focusing when you have on one hand like something for cash and on the other hand like a search, or how can you manage that?
I think it depends on the type of job. There's some energy draining things that you can do that you cannot really have more energy for something else. But also you can always find energy for things that you love. So you can have your sort of consulting thing on the side. And I'm sure you will have energy, what you're pursuing is really firing your whatever passion, if you feel passionate about something. Yeah, and I don't think you should take like full, if you pursue something for yourself, you don't have to necessarily work for someone full time. You can just take partial, like the example Gabriel gave, consulting 8 hours a week, 10 hours a week. I'm sure you'll have the energy.
I want to share another story I'm ashamed of, but I think it's also a good way of maybe looking into my process, which is at one point I was invited to talk to a student at the Sorbonne about entrepreneurship, like very briefly. It was like a 10 minutes talk and that went well. And it's not much you can do, about entrepreneurship or distance. But my last question was a question that was asking me like, what's the hardest thing I had to go through? And because I guess I'm a little bit on the spectrum, I'm trying to answer things like very straightforward. That's why I was reflecting about the hardest thing I went through, because I talked about it also for entrepreneurship. That's literally how I introduced my some of the book I wrote on Startup Weekend, which is when I lost my brother. And I think because of that, after that, I had a job offer, to give a class of entrepreneurship there. And I think they skipped me because of the awkwardness of my answer. But reflecting on it, it got me excited, like you, Gabriel, which is like, oh shit, like how would I teach entrepreneurship? Because I always rejected the idea that you can teach, like there's no rules. Even ourselves, we're talking about how do we deal with in between. There's some people who've just been all their life like expert on network, and they're just going to keep going for their next startup to be a network startup. The way I bounced out of it is I'm like, well, fuck it. I want to test my new curriculum, which is going to be copy an Inc. 5000, and the whole class has to copy the same startup, and then we can compare. Or even by restricting like things you do, you'll still end up with for sure 20 or 30 different startups. And so I started to pitch it in Estonia to a kid I saw there who wants to do an entrepreneurship, and he said, that's cool, I want to do that. So now I've got my first student, and now I'm going to keep rolling, going to build up the curriculum, and then I'm going to try to push it in Tallinn University or maybe HEC where I'm from. And I think that's always the thing about entrepreneurship is if you fail, it keeps inside you and it eats you, and you feel so bad about it that you have to address it. It's like forgetting about it is not an option, and then it becomes a great story, which is always the case. Like it's always you have this story of failing and then bouncing back. It's like Elon, waiting hours to see if he can get a job at Netscape or something like that. So
Yeah,
some hope here. Whatever you're facing, it's normal. We're weird people. Entrepreneurs are weird people.
yeah, I have this thing that I painted. Not a thing. It's a painting on my desk. It's supposed to be two eyes looking at each other, but it says, "Don't give up. You can do it." I mean, I have all of this stuff kind of just around my desk, but just it says, "Go through. Don't go around. Just go straight through."
That
Or
should be another podcast, which is when to give up, which by the way is an important subject too. You should sometime give up.
let's do that next week. I think that should be a
Yeah.
great conversation. So we've covered. I'm thinking how going back to some tactical things for what other entrepreneurs in this situation can do. I think the fifth thing, because we said you could advisory work, you could raise money, contract
Get a job.
get a job, right? The other
And sorry, I want to dive again into the get a job. Like one strategy I
let's
never
get
did,
into it.
but I'd
Yeah.
love to do. It's get a job at Google or Amazon or whatever company you have, with the intention of finding the best talent and recruiting them for your next startup, and you get paid to hang out with the people you want to, to take away from it. That's kind of an evil plan, but I always wanted to do that.
What is it again? Repeat that so we
You
can
get
know what the
hired in a
evil plan
company.
is.
Yeah, you get hired at a company, you get paid for it, but you're in a company with tons and tons of talent on AI, for example, and you're like, all right, I'm just gonna shop for co-founders, who's frustrated of their job, who hates their life, let's get a couple of coffee and say, hey, what about we jam together on weekend? And then, and you have to be careful about the limitation of your contract of what you can do, like, so you don't get screwed when you do that. But I think that's awesome, if you get paid to find your co-founder, if you can figure out a way to go where talent lives, like that's, it's kind of an evil strategy, but it's pretty, I always wanted to test that one. So maybe we'll find someone who did that.
You know what? There's a few people that I know in my network who did that, and I don't think they
interview,
but I don't think they did it intentionally. So I think
okay,
they joined the company thinking that they're going to become an entrepreneur at some point, and then like the part of the journey, the company either went like this and like that, and then they're able to leave, or it went like this, and they're like, okay, we need to. And there's obviously areas where it's like really bad where it's happened, but I think we should definitely talk to some people do it, because it's not that I don't have the strength to do that. It's more of, I don't think I would get into a company like that. Where they have all the really smart people, they're not letting me in.
You're unemployed.
No, it's super hard. Teddy knows our common friend, Brian, who always said that he couldn't get, back into Google if he wanted, like the tests are too hard now.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, would definitely never make it.
It's like Harvard. It's like Harvard 30 years ago. Everybody was able to get in, or 50 years ago, whatever it was. When my parents were growing up, that's 50 years ago. So it was much easier. And now they're like, what are these requirements? But I'm sure it's the same. Like where I went to school, Babson and NYU, it's harder. Okay, so we've got those 5 sort of areas, and I think, I want to be conscious of when someone from our community is listening to this. Reach out to us. Let us kind of know what you're working on, and don't be afraid to veer from what you think might be the right thing to do. In fact, it's probably better not to. And from my experience last week in San Francisco, I met like a ton of incredible people. Always San Francisco, New York, London, Paris. There's always, I don't know about London as much as Paris, but Paris is pretty good these days with AI. But I think it's meeting more people is really important, and you have to continue to do that as well, because that might open up some opportunities that could point you in the right direction, but also could cover some costs for things. So I think for the 3 of us, we've all been in positions where we're like, holy crap, how are we going to pay the bills next month or the following month or whatever? Now I think about it from 6 months, 7 months, like what Frank is saying, as we're getting older. It is a time to freak out and be scared and nervous and be like,
and it's normal. And it's totally normal. Like it makes total sense. You're like, it's like you don't live in La La Land where you'll be like, oh cool, like I don't have cash anymore, it's gonna be fine. No, it might be really ugly. Yeah. And so cash is king. I always remember an amazing professor and the former president of the Kaufman Foundation. He wrote a book about that, Carl Schramm, and it was advice to his kids. Guy. And amazing guy, Carl, and he wrote a book about advice for his kids. And yeah, the first thing he talks about is cash. Like it's the most important thing. Your entrepreneurship is a luxury. You don't believe all like drop everything to that. Like you have to plan for it, and it's fine. You work, you put some money on the side, you eat a bunch of pasta, and you have like some stuff you want to experiment. And at the end of the day, you can do a lot with 20K of cash, and maybe even less now with AI. But you don't be irrational about it. Like all these things are irrational. And so if you're at a point where you made an exit, you're in between, and you don't have cash, then that should be your number 1 priority versus like, what's my next company? Because your next company is not gonna, unless you have something that can make cash right away, then great. But usually, especially in venture-backed startups, you're not gonna make money for at least a year or 18 months.
Yeah. Unless you raise money, but even then, as Frank is saying,
but then it takes at least 6 months, right? I guess, or maybe in the US, maybe faster, but yeah.
I don't know. I haven't raised money during the zero interest rate, during the non-zero interest rate phenomenon. Okay, so Teddy, what's our last kind of conversation points as we come to a close here? Give us something to noodle on.
Think about why some of these perceptions about not getting a job, at least for me, or how do I put this? Like, I think the VCs sort of poison the game when it comes to like doing these things that are normal. You have a business, you you're trying to figure it out, there's no one path to figuring it out, and definitely not the way that someone else is telling you. Of course, you got money from somewhere, but then you need to do everything in your sort of skill set and capabilities to make it work. So just don't listen to the outside stories. You do what's right for you at that moment, and try to make sure you're just like ahead of the game.
I have a hard time with that. I
I don't know
love,
I don't have any general advice here. Listen, don't listen. I don't know, but it's yeah, it works.
I have this thing with this don't get a job thing. It's definitely like an ego thing for me. I don't know if it'll show up properly, but
Which is,
it's a
by
big,
the way, which always fascinated me, right? Because most people, 99.9% of people dream is to have a good job.
yeah.
And for some reason, for entrepreneurs, it's like their worst nightmare.
Up in the middle of the night. I wake up in the middle of the night. I think it was like last night or the night. Oh, please don't give me the job that gives me $500,000 a year, 250 in cash and
that's so
250 in stock options.
It is an ego thing. It's definitely an ego thing. You feel like, oh shit, you know,
And
a well-paid job is not as good as being a broke, entrepreneur for some reason in our mind.
in my mind, it's because look, I went to SF last week and I had insane meetings. I met with incredible people. I was invited to amazing things, and I'm like, would they invite me to this if I was the sales manager for ad sales at Facebook, Facebook South Florida? I'm like, yeah, I'd be making whatever, $650,000-$700,000 a year, but they'd be like, no, that guy's just at Facebook. He's got a great house, great kids. That's my biggest fear. I won't be relevant anymore.
Yeah. You become a human being with a tag on your face.
Yeah. Okay. We like to end these episodes, these steps, whatever we're calling this, because again, it's the messy middle. Everything's messy these days, with a quote. Teddy gave one last week. I did one the first week. So Franck, who actually has the most extensive repertoire of quotes saved up in his head from French philosophy,
I
will
didn't give my
us.
quote last week, or maybe I gave it to you offline. I don't know. I try to remember.
Maybe you did. I can't remember. You have you have less memory than any of us, and physical memory. That's Teddy. So from his computer. So Franck, you gotta give us.
Sure. I mean, like, to me, it's always the same, right? Which is it's from a French poet named René Char. And that's a quote that's, I keep seeing through the ages in different forms, which is think like a strategist, act like a primitive. And I think, and I just, saw this interview of Steve Jobs talking about, like, the peculiar thing of founders they have to both be thinkers and doers. It's you keep seeing the same thing over and over again. And I think you like the ability to predict the future is something I'm always obsessed with, which I guess translate for entrepreneurs as like the vision. And another version of that was P.T. Barnum, whose favorite quote was from David Crockett. And so you keep seeing this one, 19th century. And the quote was, "Remember this when I am dead. Be sure you're right, then go ahead." And it's always like the thinking part, and then the thinking, like, you're like, okay, I'm convinced that's my stupid idea, and then execute on it. And it's going to be wrong anyway. It doesn't matter. Anyway, so I really like that. And it's messy, and it's, kind of foggy and weird. And but at one point, I think once you don't make any progress, when thinking doesn't do anything else, then that's when you need to jump off the cliff and be like, I thought as much as I could. I've been thoughtful. You have to trust your education. I mean, at least for me, that was a big part, which is you forget about that because entrepreneurship is open to anyone. But, if you've been to Stanford, MIT, or whatever good school somewhere, you should be like, you should trust your brain. You should trust your education. If you spend time thinking about something and you're well-educated or self-educated, and you came to the conclusion, okay, that's roughly what I think, then, trust yourself. You'll be fine. You're not an idiot. I mean, we're all idiots, but at least you thought about it.
What I love is because we actually are all friends. We know these quotes that we all say, and Franck definitely says that a lot. And Teddy, I don't know if he sent you the Steve Jobs minute long piece on it, but yeah. So take our kind of takeaway for everyone is there's a lot of options in between. Most of them are probably bad options, and some of them will be good. So try them. and think less and do more, but also think and then do, because the reality is if you just sit around doing without thinking, you'll probably run in circles, doing things and not getting anywhere. And if you're just thinking, you're just thinking, and so,
Oh, yeah.
I think the three of us, we thought about doing this kind of podcast thing for probably years.
I-
I mean, so
And
now we're
sorry,
like,
I want to give
we got
a just a
we
quick
have 1
example.
minute. We have 1 minute.
Okay,
So
I'll be fast, but it goes to illustrate that, which was my first time experiencing that. And I remember I talked a lot about it at the early days of entrepreneurship when I was starting, and less now, which is for years I told my friends I want to do a world trip. And that's pre-entrepreneurs, like that's when I had a job. And it's been years and it's been years. I go back to my brother, which was to me very pivotal. Like, you're losing your brother, it's kind of shake your life and it'll be like, oh shit, I can die. What's life about and all these things. And then I remember very precisely looking at myself in the mirror and being like, I keep saying I want to do a world trip. Why am I not doing it? And then I was like, let's have a conversation with myself. Like, why, Frank, don't you do it? And then I realized I'm afraid. I have to quit my job. I don't know if I will get a job when I'm back. I don't know what's going to happen. And then I'm like, okay, no, I get it. It's scary. And I'm like, okay, Frank, it's scary. Do yes or no? And then you never talk about it ever again if you say no. And if you say yes, then you do it. And then I was like, yes. And then the next day, I booked my ticket. I get everything. And so whenever you're not acting, and I think like the meeting's over, but whenever you're not acting, like, it's just a sign that you need to have a conversation with yourself. That's all.
I really appreciate that story, and it allows. I mean, look, I extended it so that you could finish it. But
that's fine.
At some point, would like to get into the conversation on family. Maybe the next conversation. I can't remember what we decided what the next conversation is, but I would say the conversation after that should be family, and how family impacts us in the messy middle, our relationships, our friends, family that maybe is no longer here today, and why they inspire us to do what we do. Frank, you've mentioned twice already your brother, and I think for the three of us, we have, fantastic relationships with our partners, but also there's the element of family and when to know when. So I think it's the next one's when to quit. And then the following episode after that, I think it should be a little bit about relationships. And then we'll start getting into bringing people into the messy middle and making them messy. Okay. Have a great week, everybody. Looking forward to the next one. Teddy, anything else? I think we're good, right?
I think like because we don't know when we're going to record the next episode, just make sure you subscribe now so you can get a notification, right? It's super easy. If it's Tuesday or Friday, it doesn't matter. You'll just be notified. And yeah, all of you.
We can go Mr. Beast on it. And so next week, Teddy will be for 48 hours, running naked in New York, Times Square.
Yeah.
In circle. Don't miss that.
I know the guy who can get it all set up, Teddy. Just let me know. Ping me.
We'll
okay, everybody. Talk soon.
All right.
Miss you guys. Bye.
Miss you too.